Good morning. I noticed in the response to some of you to the question about what you expected today, I noticed somebody wrote boring, and that deeply hurts me. So I hope I won't go that direction. Also, I'm very humbled and honored to be speaking to you because I think I might have been selected because I may be the oldest guy here in terms of computing experience. I wrote my first program in 1975. At that time, you typed it out on punch cards. You didn't even get to see a computer. Oh, yeah. Thank you. You didn't even get to see a computer. You know, my knowledge is very old, and as you know, in the computer world, it's probably very useless. But hopefully I can enlighten you a little bit today about the military role in cyberspace. When I was asked to come here, the question they asked was for me to address the question of, is cyber war a reality? Well, let's start by talking about what cyber war is not. And that's essentially the application of traditional military tactics and forces against targets. So this is not about let's attack the internet. Now, if you go to look what publishers think, publishers clearly think cyber war is a reality. Obviously, they're flooding the book market with tons and tons and tons of titles. So basically, it seems like anybody who wants to get a quick sell today slaps the word cyber war on a title, and hey, presto, you've got a book. And obviously, we see this every day in the news media. If you're aware, Thursday last week at the NATO defense ministers, there were numerous announcements about responses to Russian hacking of a number of sensitive targets, and the U.S. offered offensive capabilities to NATO in its use for collective defense purposes. This is a big deal. Obviously, this room is full of you, and a hot topic because this is vitally connected to where we are as a society. And I think this is simply because this is the reality. We have over 4 billion people connected digitally in one way or another today. We have never experienced this as a race, as a race of human beings. We've never experienced this kind of interconnectivity where literally over half of the population of the planet can be in almost instantaneous contact with anyone else on the planet. And so that leads us to see behaviors and actions and things going on that we've never seen before. We have no appropriate analogies, and I think that's what I want to talk about today is focus on the idea of analogies that help and analogies that hurt. So NATO is taking this seriously because of that reality. NATO is an alliance about collective defense. It's about responding to security threats, ideally responding to them by deterring them rather than responding through military options. And that's because our political, economic, social, personal lives are now intertwined with these capabilities, as are our key social, legal, economic, etc. systems. Because these are all increasingly dependent upon cyberspace, I think NATO very naturally responded by saying that cyberspace defense has to be considered as an element of collective defense. And that's why at the Warsaw Summit 2 years ago, the heads of state and government decided on a couple of important things as regards to cyberspace. First of all, they recognized cyberspace as a domain of military operations. So they said, as NATO puts together its capabilities to respond as a military alliance, we need to factor in cyberspace. We can't simply continue to plan and conduct warfare in the way we used to and have cyberspace over here on the side as something that's kind of unrelated to it. It has to be integral with how we do that. And that means that we have to integrate that into how we do operational planning for alliance operations and missions. So this should be straightforward. This was a decision that was taken, and SHAPE as the headquarters for Alliance Allied Command Operations, the premier operational command in NATO, was given the task to make this happen. So in theory, it's very straightforward, right? We have already a fairly well-established way of looking at military capabilities within NATO. You may have heard it before. The US uses it. The UK uses a similar approach. They call it tepid oils, called .mil PFI, where we look at all the aspects of making something an operational capability, which is not just about the technical aspects of it, but it's the doctrine, the operational training. It's about logistics, personnel, et cetera. All of these factors working together. So we had a good checklist to look at to say, how can we make cyberspace part of how we do military operations? However, as we approach this, we really have two fundamental considerations at the simplest level. The first is really fairly straightforward. The fact that cyberspace is being recognized as an operational domain is not fundamentally redefining how we do military operations. So there's a lot of work goes on to deploy land forces, air forces, maritime forces to carry out a military mission or task. There's a lot involved with that, and there's a lot of experience and a lot of doctrine and a lot of training that's gone on. And that's an existing system, an existing framework that we've got to integrate cyberspace into. But the second consideration that's a challenge is to address the unique aspects, because it isn't exactly like other domains of warfare. On the first point, in terms of integration, this means that we have to integrate with how we conduct coalition operations. That means we work starting with the NATO command structure as the permanent persistent element of the military command and control structure, supported through the large base of national forces that we refer to as the NATO force structure, and then also bringing in partner forces, meaning forces from nations that are outside of NATO, and organizing that into a coalition. Another part is integrating with the other domains. What are the air aspects of cyberspace? What are the maritime? What are the land operations? How do we organize that? Because it isn't a separate force. We don't have a cyber force that we've created. I know some nations like Germany have gone down that path where they've essentially taken it aside and created another service. But most cases, it's integrated within the traditional force structures that we have in the military. This also means integrating with all these many supporting disciplines like electronic warfare, force protection, joint intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance, JISR as it's called, logistics. So we've got to figure out how is cyberspace a consideration there? It's a big factor, for example, for logistics. We've got to worry about the integrity of our logistics systems because the supply chain becomes very, very critical, not in the context as we talk about it here in cybersecurity, but in the context of military operations. Are you going to have replacement parts? Are you going to have ammunition available to maintain the operation? And we also have a fairly mature process of thinking about operations and thinking about the adversary as a system of systems. And this is, we often refer to it for short as PMISI. That's talking about looking at all the different aspects of an adversary as a system, meaning its political structure, its military structure, economic structure, social structure, informational and infrastructure arrangements, and how those are interrelated. So we already have, I would say, a fairly mature way of looking at how we go into a conflict and figuring out how they interrelate. And I think this is a key factor in terms of cyberspace operations because cyberspace is all about interdependencies. We also have a fairly mature and robust approach to situational awareness. And as we talk about cyberspace situational awareness, this means thinking not only about the traditional aspects of missions and threats, but also about network status. How do we bring that in? Not just how is it operating and how is it secured, but also the interdependency between these things. Out of which we end up basically saying, okay, what's going on? Let me understand what's going on so I can look at my response options, the so what questions, and out of that decide what actions need to be taken, the now what. And as I show here, at the simplest level, this is either a tasking that goes to the theater forces to conduct using relatively traditional military mechanisms. It may be tasking to strategic forces, which is particularly of importance for cyberspace, or it may be advice to the political level. You know, the answer to all problems is not a military response option. This also means integrating how we conduct cyberspace operations into an existing operational planning process. This is the process that NATO uses. We call it the NATO crisis response process. Other nations have similar constructs, but essentially what you see is we have indication and warning, which is the constant state. We're always in an indication and warning situation. We're always doing what's called horizon scanning, looking at what's going on. In the area of cyberspace, we have to integrate with this because there are a lot of things that go on in cyberspace which are important, that do affect you as organizations, but they're not necessarily politically or militarily critical. You know, and part of what we've got to do at SHAPE in providing support to this indication and warning is to be able to tell the difference between another bad day on the internet and something that really reflects evidence that we have a security threat. And it's our view, certainly in SHAPE, and I certainly strongly support it, which is we're unlikely to see phenomena in cyberspace exclusively as the basis of attacks against us as an alliance. It's going to be correlated with other activities. This is what we refer to as hybrid warfare. And so we go through this process where we look what's going on, making an assessment, looking at response options, including non-military response options. And out of that, when we do want to stage and take effect with the military response, we've got to organize that, plan it, carry it out, et cetera. Now, the challenge we have in terms of cyberspace is this is still a perfectly valid process, but it may have to happen much faster than we've ever been used to dealing with it before. We also have, at the tactical level, an effective decision-making process. This comes out of, I'm a retired Air Force guy, this comes out of the Air Force fighter pilot world called the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, and act. And essentially, it's always been a principle in the world of air warfare that the pilot who has the fastest OODA loop is going to be the one who wins the combat. So we've got to be able to do that. And the key throughout that, particularly as you move from one pilot sitting in a single cockpit aircraft to an entire force structure that includes air, land, maritime, cyberspace, capabilities, is that this has to be enabled through good communications. So now we start to see the paradox that we have both a reliance on communication system, and that becomes the key thing that we've got to maintain as a secure and available capability. And so in light of that consideration, we just established at the end of August of this year, based on the direction from the North Atlantic Council, the Cyberspace Operations Center at SHAPE, which has the following mission, as you can see. First, we're talking about situational awareness. That's that standing indication and warning responsibility. Second, you see provide mission assurance from the cyberspace. Mission assurance is about the ability to have high confidence you can carry out the task, regardless of what the threats are and regardless of what the vulnerabilities to your system are. And then finally, to act as a focal point for planning, preparation, and conduct of cyberspace operations. And that is a key point in the sense that we recognize that unlike other domains where you're best positioned to do command and control close to what we would call the forward edge of battle, in cyberspace, the point of greatest advantage may not be at the far end of the network, close to the contact with the adversary, their external network. It probably is going to be someplace centrally where you can see much more of what's going on. This is because we're talking about a lot of data, so you need to be in a place where you can process, you can access a lot of data, you can process a lot of data, where you have the expertise to understand what that data is. And I know I'm preaching to a crowd to some extent, because if many of you are coming from the computer emergency response team world, you know that that works because you have the ability to work and bring a team together very quickly. So those are kind of how we integrate cyberspace into the military way of doing business, but what about the unique aspects? And those are the real challenges that we face. Well, the first one we have to face right up front is immaturity. This is not something that we've been doing a long time. You know, mankind has been conducting land warfare for over 5,000 years. We have a lot of experience about that. You know, we have great thick books about that. We've been conducting sea warfare for over 2,000 years. So there's a lot of experience at what works in that environment, in that domain. Even air warfare is over 100 years old. The Royal Air Force just last year celebrated its 100th anniversary. And so that area, even though it's still emerging, it's still quite mature in the sense that there's been a lot of air operational experience, and things that might have made sense in the teens and 20s have been abandoned and refined through enhanced doctrine. But what about cyberspace? Well, if you ever see anything about this, the first thing everybody says is whoever is doing cyberspace warfare isn't talking about it. Well, very often, probably one of the reasons they're not talking about it is because of classification, but also one of the reasons they're not talking about it is they've probably stumbled and fallen far more times than they've had wins. And people don't want to talk about those things, even though those are great lessons learned opportunities. Another unique aspect is the nature of the threats. I would maintain that the greatest value that cyber defense can provide to NATO by being approached as an operational domain is before the conflict, by assuring that we have these capabilities in place all the time. Before the conflict, first and foremost, because I think we can prevent crises from emerging out of cyberspace if we do a better job of collaborating and coordinating our responses across the many stakeholders. Also, we have threats that take place over very long periods of time. They develop, they mutate. These are things that we often don't see in a conventional warfare world. You often only get to test these tactics by actually using them in a combat opportunity. You know, there are many people who are arguing that Syria right now is the greatest test bed that the conventional forces have for their techniques and tactics. Another one is persistence. In other words, unlike some of these other domains where we go into an area of combat in the context of a crisis or a conflict, this is a conflict that in effect is going on all the time. We have threats happening all the time that we have to deal with. And I would maintain that this is, again, where NATO can bring some value to this process by saying, let's do this day in and day out. Let's not establish these things that we ramp up in the case of a crisis. Let's have it all the time. Let's have it in place. An additional aspect that's unique to cyberspace is that it doesn't fit well within our traditional concepts about geography. And here, again, it's a matter of analogies that simply don't work to our advantage. If you work in the defense world at all, you've probably seen pictures like this before. This is what we call an OV1, operational view 1, and you see lots of links and you see lots of communications. I just want to take a couple of important points from this. First of all, you don't see a lot of internet in that picture, do you? You see a lot of radio frequency, tactical data links. You see satellite communications. That's because we still rely on those things when we do deployed military operations. They're still a key part of how we operate in terms of conventional warfare. That's an important part. A lot of our cyberspace is there. It's not all necessarily in the internet, which is a unique aspect we have to deal with in the military world. But in terms of geography, when we talk about a military operation, we typically define the joint operational area in terms of boundaries. This is the area in which forces are employed. This is the area in which the rules of engagement for the conflict can be carried out. And this is generally the area within which a commander has authority. But as we can see just from this picture, there's an awful lot of cyberspace that can affect an operation in theater that sit physically outside the theater, right? So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that paradigm of command and control when much of these assets are outside the theater commander's control? How do you manage that? And then finally, there's an even greater part of cyberspace, and this does include the internet, that sits outside any military control. It sits in your hands. This is your commercial systems, your governmental systems, your police systems, your non-governmental systems. This is social media. This is not an area that the military has effective responses in, and it may not be appropriate for military responses. But it is within what we call the area of interest. Now, commanders may not have responsibility for the area of interest, but they have to be aware of it because it can affect what's happening in their area of operation. So as I like to break it down, this really says that we've got to bin our problems in kind of three big piles. First, those sorts of things that we can do that fit within the theater commander's control and means to effect, that essentially fit well within traditional military paradigms. The second set are things that have appropriate military responses, but they're really outside the traditional theater command structure. And this has to be dealt with at the strategic level, because these are what in the US we refer to as low density, high demand assets. Things like strategic reconnaissance platforms, satellite communications. These are systems that, among other things, aren't typically only supporting one operation. They may be doing multiple tasks and missions in parallel. And then finally, there is a big chunk that's outside of military control and the military means to effect. Another aspect of analogies that won't work are essentially how we apply forces. You know, and this is what I often encounter this. I want to have cyber situational awareness so the commander can sit in the control room and be looking at a screen kind of along the lines of a radar screen and seeing incoming threats. But as you all know, this isn't the way it works in the real world. You're not going to be sitting there and watching live feeds and seeing systems be attacked. That's not the way it typically happens. And it also doesn't work for offense. The idea of hacking back, force-on-force applications. They may make sense great in a conventional warfare situation. It probably doesn't make sense in cyberspace operations. We also have the fact that unlike in most conventional arms capabilities, attacks in cyberspace can take a long time to effect, right? They can be positioned a long time before any actual effect is induced. This is the whole business about infiltrating systems and essentially doing what's called intel preparation of the battlefield. Preparing the systems for an attack that you may take place. Or actually having compromises that you don't notice until much long after the effect has taken place. Or worse, sometimes we don't even know it's happened. You know, the really successful infiltration attempts and the really successful cyber attacks, I would maintain, are the ones that we haven't even figured out yet. Because they're probably still going on. If you haven't figured it out, you can keep doing it. I think we've also learned in the last 2 years that a key part of cyberspace operations is about social media, use of media channels, and disinformation. This is something we understood well in the context of psychological operations and information operations back in traditional, using more conventional media like leaflets and radio broadcasts. Well, now we see it happening over cyberspace. And we've got to get a lot smarter about this. And again, I think part of what's going on right now is reflecting the lag between the effect and our ability as a society to catch up with it. Our ability of our relatively crude brains to catch up to the dynamics that are happening here. Our brains were never used to operating with communications at the pace and at the volumes that we're having to deal with it today. And no surprise, it takes a while before we get smart. Now, I would like to hope that this information is a transitory phenomenon in the sense that we will eventually learn not to respond to emails about transferring money to Nigerian bank accounts, even though amazingly that still works on some people. But one day we will all learn that, and we'll make jokes about don't respond to the Nigerian bank account scam. It's also about establishing norms of behavior. And I have to differ a little bit. I mean, I highly respect the choice of the cyber chess title for this conference, but you know, in some ways, chess is not a good analogy for what's going on right now. Now, why is that? Because in chess, both players are playing by the rules, and they're playing by the same rules. How do you play chess when the other player kicks the pieces off the board? We don't know. In fact, I would say part of what's going on right now, at least what was happening, say, 2 to 3 years ago, was what would happen exactly if that happened in a chess game. We would stand up and we would react with shock. We're playing chess. You kicked the piece off the board. You're not supposed to do that in chess. Well, he's not playing chess. He's playing the win. So part of what we've got to do is by establishing norms of behavior, we narrow the bounds of what's acceptable. So in part, it's like making your sensors more, narrowing the bandwidth or narrowing the sensitivity on your sensors so you can pick out anomalies faster. It's essentially bounding and helping to scope what is anomalous and inappropriate behavior so that we can identify it and respond to it much faster. Cyberspace also has the challenge because of the magnitude and the number of systems that are involved, particularly if you look at the numbers now that we start automating inert and automated devices through the Internet of Things, through ICT automation and ICS automation. You know, this is a great picture. You know, anybody who is attempting to maintain a map of the Internet today knows the number one, it's perishable. The moment that you actually produced it, it's no longer accurate. And that's simply when 4 billion people are at work, these things will change and these interconnections will change. And so we're not talking about a network, we're talking about a network of networks. And if you look actually in terms of research, this creates phenomena that we're not well prepared to deal with, okay? We don't actually have a lot of analysis of what happens when you have these knock-on effects. And so I would say one of our biggest challenges in cyberspace from a defensive standpoint, from a security standpoint, is we don't know what we don't know, right? And the amount of stuff that we don't know because of second and third order and fourth order effects is significant. And the better we attune ourselves to those things, the less likely we will to be exploited, to have them exploited to our disadvantage. Another factor we have to recognize is this is not a world where one king rules, right? This is a fundamental principle of the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is one of its, it's one of its magnificent features. No kings and running code. This is whoever can advance the state and make that known, and if two parties can implement a new protocol, you can start using it. So that's the nature. We're not going to be able to say, I'm in charge and you're all going to, again, you're not all going to follow my rules. And for that reason, we have to recognize that cyber defense is a multi-party process and it's decentralized. There are lots of players in this game. The military is absolutely part of it. Industry is part of it. Government is part of that. The police are part of that. Intelligence is part of that. The court system is part of that. Non-governmental entities like the IETF, like ICANN, like all those other kinds of supporting structures. They are all part of how we provide a higher level of assurance in cyberspace. So to go back to the question that was asked, is cyber war a reality? I think the answer is really two things. We on the military side recognize that what happens in cyberspace absolutely can affect how we would fight a war. And we have to prepare with that in mind. We have to understand how to deal with that. We can't continue to set it aside as something outside the domain of military operations. But unlike a lot of those other areas, how we defend cyberspace is about much more than just what the military does. Because, as I think has often been stated, cyber defense is really team sport. So all I can say with that is game on. Thank you.
Maybe somebody has a question for Brad about this excellent presentation.
I scared you all, didn't I?
Don't see any hands, and the lights are still strong. I think it's a great insight and a very valuable angle that we all have to think about, and the more we hear about the military role, the more questions it brings, but I think it's really important also to know the perspective how you at NATO and SHAPE see these things, so thank you very much.
Thank you.